March 1943. The Markham Valley of New Guinea. Captain James Holbrook of the United States Army stood in ankle-deep mud watching 12 men prepare for a mission his entire battalion had failed to complete 3 times. 12 Australians. No artillery. Support. No air cover. No backup plan. The Japanese strongpoint at Shaggy Ridge had killed 47 Americans in 2 weeks. Command said it was impregnable. These men were walking toward it like they owned the jungle. Holbrook had seen confidence before. This was something else. 137 Japanese soldiers were killed. 12 Australians. 0 casualties. Pentagon observers called the numbers impossible. MacArthur's staff demanded investigation. Soviet military analysts studying Pacific operations rejected the reports as propaganda. You think you know jungle warfare? You're wrong. How did 12 men achieve what entire American battalions could not? Why did U.S. commanders refuse to? Let Australian commandos operate independently after this mission? What made these soldiers so effective that their own allies feared their methods? Stay until the end, because what happened on that ridge changed how 2 armies understood courage and revealed a truth about warfare that no military academy taught. Rain came in sheets that turned the jungle floor into a swamp of rotting vegetation and churned earth. Holbrook watched the Australians move through their final equipment check with an economy of motion that bordered on ritual. No wasted movement, no unnecessary conversation. Their leader, a lieutenant whose name Holbrook recorded as Mackenzie, in his report, carried a Thompson submachine gun wrapped in canvas to keep moisture from the action. The weapon looked ancient. The man carrying it looked ageless. Weathered skin stretched over sharp features. Eyes that never stopped moving. He noticed Holbrook watching and walked over, boots making no sound despite the mud. Your men tried the direct approach, Mackenzie said. Not a question, a statement. Holbrook nodded, 3 times. Lost 16 killed, 31 wounded. The Japanese have machine gun positions covering every approach. Mortar pre-sighted on the trails. Snipers in the canopy. We can't get close. Enough to use demolitions. Mackenzie looked toward the ridge, invisible through the jungle canopy and rain. You are trying to fight through them. We're going to fight around them. The distinction seemed meaningless to Holbrook. The jungle was impenetrable. The maps showed cliffs. The terrain made flanking maneuvers impossible. Mackenzie must have read his expression. The jungle isn't your enemy, mate. It's your ally. You just haven't learned to speak its language yet. The patrol left at 0400 hours, moving into darkness so complete that Holbrook, positioned as an observer with the command element, could not see the man in front of him. The Australians navigated by sound and touch, hands occasionally reaching back to guide the Americans attached to the patrol. They moved for 3 hours without breaking radio silence. No light, no conversation, just movement through terrain that American forces had mapped as impassable. Holbrook lost track of direction within the first hour. The Australians never hesitated. At first light, they stopped on a ridge overlooking the Japanese position from an angle no American patrol had approached. Mackenzie studied the enemy defenses through field glasses, completely relaxed, as if sitting in a park rather than 300 meters from soldiers who had killed 47 of Holbrook's men. The mission had begun 6 weeks earlier when the U.S. 32nd Infantry Division reached the Markham Valley during the New Guinea campaign. The Japanese had established defensive positions throughout the region, turning the jungle into a fortress of interconnected strongpoints. Shaggy Ridge was the tactical key. Control the ridge, control the valley. Control the valley, open the route to Lae and the coast. American forces attacked with doctrine forged in the deserts of North Africa and adapted poorly to the jungle. Infantry companies advanced in line, supported by artillery that mostly detonated in the canopy. The Japanese let them come close, then unleashed interlocking fire from positions Americans could not see until they were already dying. 3 separate assaults, 3 separate failures. Casualty rates climbed, morale dropped. The battalion commander requested airstrikes. The Air Force dropped bombs that killed more trees than the Japanese. The position remained impregnable. Word reached Australian forces operating in adjacent sectors. The 2nd Independent Company, hardened by 2 years of jungle fighting, offered assistance. The American command initially refused. Pride, doctrine, the belief that American forces could solve American problems. But casualties mounted. The strategic timeline demanded progress. MacArthur's headquarters, always sensitive to inter-allied cooperation, suggested a joint operation. The suggestion was not optional. The Australian company commander proposed an alternative. Give us 12 men. Give us 48 hours. We will clear the position or tell you why it cannot be cleared. The American command agreed, expecting intelligence, not results. The Australians Mackenzie selected were not the biggest men in his unit. They were not the youngest or the strongest. They were survivors, men who had fought at Milne Bay and the Kokoda Track, who had patrolled in Papua when American forces were still training in Queensland, who had learned jungle warfare, not from manuals, but from Japanese soldiers, who taught through brutal action that the jungle rewarded certain skills and killed everyone else. They had learned. They had survived. They had become something other than conventional soldiers. The jungle had changed them in ways that could not be reversed. They moved through it like apex predators, confident and patient, understanding that speed was often the opposite of efficiency. The contrast between American and Australian methodology was philosophical before it became tactical. American doctrine in 1943 was built around firepower superiority and combined arms coordination. Infantry advanced while artillery suppressed enemy positions. Air support struck defensive concentrations. Armor exploited breakthroughs. The system worked in North Africa against German forces operating in open terrain. It worked in Europe, where infrastructure supported logistics and communication. In the jungles of New Guinea, it collapsed against an enemy who refused to fight the American way. The Japanese built positions that were invisible until you walked into their killing zones. They used terrain that artillery could not effectively target. They moved through a jungle that Americans considered impassable. They turned American strengths into irrelevant assets and American weaknesses into fatal vulnerabilities. The Australians had learned different lessons, not from doctrine, from defeat. The Japanese invasion of New Guinea in 1942 had been a catastrophe. Outnumbered Australian forces were pushed back along the Kokoda Track in a fighting retreat that came within miles of Port Moresby. The Australians learned by bleeding. They learned that the jungle was not terrain to cross. It was an environment to inhabit. They learned that firepower meant nothing if you could not see targets. They learned that patience and stealth achieved what aggression and speed could not. Most importantly, they learned that the jungle would teach you or kill you, and the teaching was often indistinguishable from the killing. The men who survived became students of an environment that most Western soldiers never understood. Holbrook watched Mackenzie position his patrol throughout the morning. They moved into the jungle surrounding the Japanese position like water seeping into cracks. No rush, no noise. When they disappeared into vegetation 15 meters away, Holbrook could not locate them even when he knew their approximate positions. The waiting began. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Holbrook expected an assault, a firefight, some indication that 12 men were attacking a fortified position held by over 100 Japanese soldiers. Instead, silence. The rain continued. The jungle dripped. Insects hummed. No gunfire. No explosions. Nothing. At 13:20 hours, a single shot broke the silence. And another. 3 more in rapid succession. Then quiet again. Holbrook's radio crackled. Mackenzie's voice, calm as if reporting weather. First machine gun position neutralized. Moving to position 2. Holbrook relayed the message. To battalion command, the response was skeptical. How many casualties? Unknown. How many enemies were killed? Unknown. What is your situation? Proceeding as planned. The radio went silent again. Holbrook stared at the jungle, trying to understand. What was happening 300 meters away? The sounds that followed over the next 6 hours told a story his training had not prepared him to interpret. The Australians were not attacking the Japanese position. They were disassembling it, piece by piece, position by position. They had identified every machine gun nest, every mortar pit, every fighting position during their observation phase. Now they moved through the defensive network like surgeons removing tumors. A burst of Thompson submachine gun fire. Silence. The thump of grenades. Silence. Occasional rifle shots. Long periods of nothing. The pattern repeated. Each time Mackenzie reported another position cleared. Each time Holbrook struggled to believe that 12 men were systematically destroying a defensive network that had withstood 3 battalion strength attacks. The Japanese commander recognized the threat by mid-afternoon. He sent reinforcements to positions under attack. The Australians ambushed them on the trails. He pulled men from other sectors to consolidate his defense. The Australians moved into the abandoned positions. He called for artillery support from positions further up the ridge. The shells landed on coordinates where Australians had been an hour earlier. By nightfall, the Japanese strongpoint was no longer a coherent defensive position. It was a collection of isolated fighting positions being eliminated one by an enemy who moved through the jungle like it was an extension of their bodies. Thompson's submachine gun became the symbol of Australian methodology. The weapon was American-designed, heavy, reliable, devastating at close range. The Australians carried them wrapped in canvas, protected from moisture and mud, maintained with obsessive care. In jungle fighting, where engagement ranges were measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, the Thompson was perfect. It could punch through vegetation. It could suppress enemy positions long enough for grenades to be thrown. It could kill multiple enemies in the confined spaces of bunkers and fighting positions. Most importantly, it made a sound that terrorized the Japanese. A distinctive hammering report that announced Australian presence. The Americans had tried to use artillery and air power to intimidate the enemy. The Australians used the Thompson. The sound of that weapon firing in the jungle meant Australians were close. And if Australians were close, you were probably already dead. Night fell, and the Australians continued working. They moved through darkness that Americans could not navigate. They attacked positions the Japanese thought secure because night provided protection. The attacks came from unexpected directions. A grenade through a firing slit. A burst of Thompson. Fire into a bunker entrance. Rifle fire from elevation that should have been inaccessible. The Japanese defenders stopped sleeping. They fired at sounds. They illuminated areas with flares that revealed nothing. They called out to each other to confirm positions, giving away locations. The psychological pressure was deliberate. Mackenzie understood that tired, frightened men made mistakes. He wanted them exhausted. He wanted them to be paranoid. He wanted them to make errors that turned defensive advantages into fatal vulnerabilities. By dawn of the second day, the Japanese position had collapsed. Not through frontal assault, through systematic destruction of cohesion. The defenders were isolated in small groups, cut off from leadership, unsure where attacks would come from next. Mackenzie had achieved what military theorists would later recognize as a perfect example of infiltration tactics. His patrol had penetrated enemy defenses, moved freely through supposedly secure areas, attacked from positions the enemy thought impossible to reach. The final assault began at 0630 hours. The Australians attacked 6 different positions simultaneously. The synchronized assault lasted 11 minutes. 137 Japanese soldiers were killed. The remainder retreated up the ridge, abandoning equipment, supplies, and defensive works that had withstood weeks of American attacks. Holbrook entered the captured position 2 hours later with the lead elements of his company. The scene was surreal. Japanese bodies lay in and around fighting positions. Weapons were scattered. Ammunition was still stacked in bunkers. The defensive works were sophisticated and well constructed. They should have been impregnable. But the Australians had not tried to break through the defenses. They had gone around them, through them, over them, attacking from directions the Japanese had not anticipated because those directions seemed impossible. Holbrook found Mackenzie sitting on an ammunition crate, cleaning his Thompson, looking like he had spent the last 2 days on leave, rather than killing over 100 enemy soldiers. "You'll want to secure this quickly," Mackenzie said, gesturing toward the ridge above them. "They'll counterattack by noon if they have the strength. If they don't, you can move up to the next position." Holbrook asked about casualties. Mackenzie stood, slinging the Thompson. "Some scrapes. Corporal Hayes took shrapnel from one of their grenades. Nothing serious. 12 men. 48 hours. 137 confirmed enemy dead. 0 Australian casualties." The numbers made no sense. Holbrook said so. Mackenzie's expression did not change. "The numbers make perfect sense if you understand the jungle. You are fighting the terrain and the enemy simultaneously. We only fought the enemy. The terrain was on our side because we made it our side. The distinction was everything. American forces approached jungle warfare as an obstacle to overcome. The vegetation impeded movement. The terrain channeled advances. The environment exhausted soldiers. American doctrine tried to mitigate these challenges through firepower and support assets. Blast through the jungle with artillery. Clear landing. Zones for helicopter insertion. Use flamethrowers to burn vegetation. The approach treated the jungle as an enemy. The Australians treated it as an ally. They moved through vegetation rather than clearing it. They used terrain features for concealment and approach routes. They thrived in conditions that exhausted other soldiers because they had adapted to the environment rather than trying to force the environment to adapt to them. The philosophical difference extended to concepts of courage and aggression. American military culture valued frontal assault, direct engagement, closing with the enemy and destroying him through superior firepower and aggressive tactics. This methodology worked against many enemies. It was brave. It was straightforward. It was honorable according to Western military tradition. But in jungle warfare against an enemy who excelled at defense and ambush, American aggression produced casualty rates that were unsustainable. The Australians had learned that patience was not cowardice. That indirect approach was not dishonorable. That spending 12 hours positioning for a 12-minute assault was not timidity, but wisdom. The transformation in American thinking came slowly. After Shaggy Ridge, U.S. commanders requested additional Australian support for clearing operations. The Australian independent companies provided liaison officers and advisors. Joint patrols became common. American soldiers learned Australian methods through direct observation. How to move silently, how to read jungle signs, how to position for ambush, how to attack from unexpected directions. The learning curve was steep. American forces were never as effective in the jungle as the Australians, but they improved. Casualty rates dropped. Mission success rates increased. The acknowledgement was grudging but real. The Australians knew something Americans did not, but resistance remained. American military culture struggled with Australian methodology because it challenged foundational assumptions. The Australians operated with minimal supervision. Patrols disappeared for days without communication. They disregarded rank in ways that shocked American officers. A private with jungle experience would make tactical decisions that superseded a lieutenant's orders. American forces maintained a strict hierarchy because discipline was considered essential to unit cohesion. The Australians maintained flexibility because they believed that the man on the ground with the best information should make the decision, regardless of rank. The cultural clash was inevitable. The incident that created permanent tension occurred 6 weeks after Shaggy Ridge. An Australian patrol operating in the American sector encountered Japanese forces and engaged without coordinating. With U.S. command, the engagement was successful. The Australians killed 37 enemy soldiers and captured supplies and documents. But American artillery, unaware of Australian presence in the area, fired support missions that nearly hit the Australian patrol. Mackenzie filed a formal complaint. The American command filed their own complaint about unauthorized operations. In their sector, MacArthur's headquarters mediated. The result was a directive that limited Australian independent operations in American sectors and required coordination for all joint missions. The Australians interpreted the directive as an American command asserting control at the expense of operational effectiveness. The Americans interpreted Australian frustration as insubordination and recklessness. Both perspectives had validity. The Americans were responsible for their sectors and needed to coordinate all operations to prevent friendly fire and confusion. The Australians had achieved results through methods that required independence and flexibility that American command structure could not accommodate. The tension was not personal. It was institutional. Two military cultures with different histories, different doctrine, different assumptions about how wars should be fought. Holbrook spent the remainder of his time in New Guinea thinking about what he had witnessed. The official report he filed was factual and restrained. 12 Australians cleared a Japanese strongpoint that had resisted 3 American battalion attacks. Casualties were 137 Japanese killed versus 0 Australian casualties. The mission was achieved through infiltration tactics, detailed reconnaissance, patient positioning, and precise execution. The report was circulated through command channels. It became a case study at several training centers. But Holbrook's private journal, discovered decades later, revealed deeper thoughts. The Australians are not better soldiers in the conventional sense. They are different soldiers in a fundamental sense. They have adapted to jungle warfare by becoming part of the jungle. We are trying to impose our will on the environment. They have learned to work within it. The difference is philosophical, but the results are measurable. They achieve what we cannot because they are willing to become what we will not. The Thompson remained central to Australian identity in jungle warfare. When American forces were issued the lighter M1 carbine and M3 grease gun, the Australians retained the Thompson. They preferred the weight because it provided stability. They preferred the .45 caliber round because it had stopping power in close quarters combat. They preferred the drum magazines despite loading difficulties because firepower mattered when you were inside enemy positions. The weapon became iconic. Photographs of Australian soldiers in New Guinea almost always showed Thompson. It was not just a weapon. It was a statement. We fight at close range. We engage the enemy on terms that require courage and skill rather than standoff firepower. The Thompson symbolized an approach to warfare that was intimate and brutal and effective. The Japanese learned to fear the sound of Thompson fire in the jungle. Intelligence reports captured after the war showed that Japanese commanders identified Australian units by the presence of Thompson submachine guns in contacts. Tactical directives warned against engaging Australian patrols unless absolutely necessary. The Australians had achieved psychological dominance through a combination of tactical skill and calculated ruthlessness. They took a few prisoners in jungle fighting, not from cruelty, but from practicality. Small patrols moving through enemy territory could not secure prisoners and continue their mission. The Japanese knew this. They knew that contact with Australians usually meant fight to the death because surrender was not an option. The psychological pressure was immense. By late 1943, the pattern was established. Australian independent companies operated throughout New Guinea with remarkable effectiveness. They conducted long-range patrols deep into Japanese-held territory. They gathered intelligence. They ambushed supply lines. They killed isolated garrisons. They created psychological pressure that forced Japanese forces to divert resources to rear area security. The strategic impact was disproportionate to their numbers. Several thousand Australian commandos were achieving effects that tied down tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers. American commanders recognized the value while remaining uncomfortable with the methods. The discomfort was cultural and operational. Americans valued measurable results achieved through conventional operations. The Australian approach was harder to quantify. How do you measure the value of a patrol that spends 2 weeks behind enemy lines, kills 20 Japanese soldiers in 5 separate ambushes, gathers intelligence on enemy dispositions, and returns without casualties? The body count was 20, but the intelligence enabled airstrikes that killed 200 more. The psychological impact caused Japanese forces to abandon positions they might have held. The actual value was impossible to calculate because it rippled through second and third order effects. American military culture struggled with operations that could not be easily measured and reported. There was also the question of cost. The Australians achieved remarkable results, but they operated outside conventional support structures. They relied on airdrops for resupply. They could not be reinforced if they got into trouble. They operated with risk profiles that the American command considered unacceptable. When an Australian patrol was lost, which happened occasionally despite their skill, they were simply gone. No rescue, no recovery. American forces invested heavily in supporting their forward elements. Casualty evacuation, medical support, quick reaction forces. The infrastructure was expensive, but it reflected American values about the worth of individual soldiers. The Australians operated with calculations that seemed ruthless by American standards. Missions were worth the risk. Soldiers understood that risk. Sometimes men died, and the mission continued. The philosophical divide came to a head in early 1944 when MacArthur's headquarters proposed integrated American-Australian Special Operations Units. The idea was to combine American resources and organizational capability with Australian tactical expertise. Planning sessions revealed that integration was impossible without one side abandoning their fundamental methodology. American special operations required defined command structures, detailed planning, and extensive support coordination. Australian operations required flexibility, independent decision-making, and minimal support requirements. The proposal died quietly. The two forces continued operating separately, occasionally coordinating, but never truly integrating. Holbrook returned to the United States in late 1944. He carried memories of 12 men walking into impossible situations and emerging victorious. He taught jungle warfare at Fort Benning for a year, incorporating lessons learned from the Australians. The reception was mixed. Some officers appreciated the tactical insights. Others dismissed the Australians as anomalies operating in unique circumstances that were not applicable to American forces. Holbrook tried to explain that the lessons were not tactical. They were philosophical. The willingness to adapt to the environment rather than forcing the environment to adapt. The patience to spend days positioning for minutes of combat. The understanding that indirect approaches often achieved what frontal assaults could not. The explanations fell flat. American military culture was not ready to embrace methodology that contradicted foundational assumptions about courage, aggression, and the proper way to wage war. The Thompson faded from American service after World War II. New weapons replaced it, lighter, more advanced. The M3A1, the M1 carbine, eventually the M16. Each generation promised improvements, but none carried the symbolic weight of the Thompson. For the Australians, the weapon remained in service longer. It was used in Malaya during the emergency. It was carried in Borneo during the confrontation. It was eventually replaced, but the memory remained. Old soldiers who had carried the Thompson in New Guinea spoke about the weapon with a reverence that younger soldiers did not fully understand. It was not nostalgia. It was recognition that the weapon represented a specific moment when Australian forces proved themselves in the most hostile environment on Earth and emerged with a reputation that would define them for generations. The jungle itself was the final teacher. Americans who survived combat in New Guinea carried complicated feelings about the environment. It was hostile. It was exhausting. It was alien. They were grateful to leave it behind. The Australians developed a different relationship. They respected the jungle. They understood it as a complex ecosystem that operated according to rules that could be learned. The learning required humility. It required the willingness to accept that the environment was stronger than human will and that survival required accommodation rather than conquest. This lesson, learned in the jungles of New Guinea, would define Australian military culture for decades. The willingness to adapt, the understanding that flexibility was strength, the recognition that sometimes the best way to win was to become something other than what you were when you started. MacArthur's final reports from the New Guinea campaign included acknowledgement of Australian contributions. The language was diplomatic and measured. Australian forces had performed with distinction. Their jungle warfare expertise had been valuable. Coordination between Allied forces had been generally successful. The words hid the reality. Australian. Independent companies had achieved operational results disproportionate to their numbers. They had humiliated better-equipped American units through superior tactics and adaptation. They had forced American commanders to reconsider fundamental assumptions about jungle warfare. And they had done it all while operating with minimal support and maximum independence, proving that small numbers of exceptional soldiers could outperform large numbers of conventional forces in the right environment. The lessons lingered. When American forces deployed to Vietnam 2 decades later, some commanders remembered New Guinea. They remembered the Australians. They requested Australian advisors and liaison officers. Some arrived. Australian SAS deployed to Vietnam in 1966, operating with the same methodology that had proven effective in New Guinea. Small patrols, deep penetration, patient observation, precise violence. The results were similar. Disproportionate kill ratios, minimal casualties. Psychological impact on enemy forces. The American response was similar too. Admiration mixed with discomfort. Recognition of effectiveness mixed with resistance to methodology. The pattern established in New Guinea repeated in Vietnam. 2 allied armies fighting the same enemy with different philosophies, achieving different results, never fully reconciling their approaches. Holbrook retired from the Army in 1963. he lived quietly in Virginia, working as a consultant for defense contractors. He gave occasional lectures at military schools. He never spoke publicly about his discomfort with American doctrine or his admiration for Australian methods. The contradictions were too deep. He believed in American military power. He had served honorably. But he had witnessed something in New Guinea that challenged his belief that American methodology was universally superior. The 12 Australians who walked toward Shaggy Ridge had proved that alternatives existed. That different approach worked. That courage and effectiveness took many forms. The recognition did not diminish American soldiers or American methods. It simply acknowledged that the American way was not the only way. The photographs from Shaggy Ridge showed Australian soldiers posing with captured Japanese weapons, Thompson's slung casually, faces weathered by jungle and combat, eyes that had seen things no training manual described. They looked relaxed, confident. They had achieved what others considered impossible and treated it as routine. The photographs circulated through military intelligence channels. Analysts studied them for tactical insights. They missed the deeper truth. The photographs showed men who had adapted to an environment that defeated others, who had learned lessons that could not be taught in classrooms, who had become something other than conventional soldiers through experience and necessity. The transformation was not visible in photographs. It was visible in results, that the numbers told the story more clearly than any narrative. Australian independent. Companies in New Guinea operated with roughly 3,000 men at peak strength. They conducted thousands of patrols over 2 years. They engaged Japanese forces in countless contacts. They achieved kill ratios that averaged above 20-1. In documented engagements, they captured supplies, intelligence, and territory with casualty rates significantly lower than conventional forces. The strategic impact was impossible to calculate precisely, but undeniably significant. Japanese forces in New Guinea were never able to consolidate effective defense or mount sustained offensive operations in areas where Australian commandos operated. The presence of a few hundred Australian soldiers created uncertainty and pressure that affected Japanese planning and intel. Operations across entire regions. American forces achieved victory in New Guinea through conventional means. Superior numbers, industrial capacity, naval and air dominance, artillery and logistics. The pathway to victory was paved with resources and firepower. Thousands of Americans died in the process. Tens of thousands were wounded. The victory was real and earned through courage and sacrifice. But it was achieved despite tactical methodology rather than because of it. The Australians achieved their objectives through different means: adaptation, stealth, patience, precise, violence delivered at close range, fewer men, lower casualties, disproportionate results. Both approaches worked in their own way, but only one approach proved that small numbers of exceptional soldiers could achieve what large numbers of conventional soldiers could not. The sound of the Thompson firing in the jungle became the sonic signature of Australian presence. Japanese soldiers who survived combat against Australian patrols described the terror of that distinctive hammering report echoing through vegetation. It meant Australians were close. It meant they had achieved surprise. It meant you were probably about to die. The psychological impact was profound. The Thompson was not a particularly sophisticated weapon. It was heavy and used outdated design principles. But in the hands of soldiers who understood jungle warfare, who moved silently through terrain others considered impassable, who attacked from positions that should have been impossible to reach, the weapon became a symbol of methodological superiority. Not technological superiority, not industrial superiority. The superiority of adapted soldiers over conventional forces in an environment that rewarded specific skills, MacArthur moved his headquarters forward as the New Guinea campaign progressed toward its inevitable conclusion. Japanese forces were being systematically destroyed through attrition and isolation. The strategic victory belonged to American industrial might and naval superiority. The tactical lessons belonged to soldiers who learned in combat that doctrine was less important than adaptation, that firepower was less important than position, that aggression was less important than patience. American forces absorbed some of these lessons. Others were forgotten or ignored. The Australians retained everything they learned because survival had depended on learning. Their military culture was transformed by New Guinea in ways that persisted for generations. The ridge stood empty after the battle. Rain washed away blood and evidence. Jungle reclaimed fighting positions within weeks. Within months, the area showed no sign of combat except for rust on abandoned equipment and bones that would occasionally surface when heavy rains disturbed the earth. The ground remembered what historians would struggle to explain, that 12 men had achieved what others considered impossible, not through superior courage or better weapons, but through superior adaptation and methodology. The story became part of Australian military folklore, stories told to new soldiers as examples of what was possible when training, courage, and adaptation combined. The details were sometimes exaggerated. The numbers were sometimes inflated, but the core truth remained. Australians had proven something essential in the jungles of New Guinea, that warfare was not one thing, but many things. Those American methods worked, but were not the only methods that worked. That sometimes the quiet professionals who adapted completely to their environment achieved more than the powerful forces who tried to force the environment to adapt to them. Holbrook died in 1987. His journal and papers were donated to military archives. Researchers discovered his private thoughts about New Guinea and the Australians decades after the events. The observations were clear-eyed and honest. He had served with distinction. He had led American soldiers in difficult circumstances. He had achieved his missions, but he had also witnessed methodology that challenged everything his training had taught him about the proper way to wage war. The Australians had not fought according to American doctrine. They had achieved results that American doctrine considered impossible. The contradiction never fully resolved in his mind. He died respecting both approaches while understanding that they emerged from different cultural foundations and served different operational philosophies. The Thompson submachine gun sits in museums now. Display cases with plaques explaining its role in World War II. The weapon looks crude next to modern firearms. Heavy, outdated, inefficient by contemporary standards. But the soldiers who carried it in New Guinea would recognize something visitors miss. The Thompson was never about technological sophistication. It was about matching weapons to methodology. In the hands of soldiers who fought at close range in the jungle, who ambushed enemy patrols on narrow trails, who assaulted bunkers from point-blank range, the weapon was perfect. The heavy recoil provided stopping power. The .45 caliber round punched through vegetation and human bodies with equal effectiveness. The distinctive sound announced the Australian presence and created psychological pressure that defeated enemies before combat began. The weapon was a tool matched perfectly to specific methodology. Like the soldiers who carried it, the Thompson achieved extraordinary results, not through sophistication, but through perfect adaptation to environment and mission. The jungle keeps its secret still. The sites where Australian patrols ambushed Japanese columns are unmarked. The trails where Holbrook watched 12 men disappear toward impossible missions have been reclaimed by vegetation. The ridge where 137 Japanese died defending a position they thought secure is now a peaceful tropical forest. No monuments mark the location. No plaques explain what happened. The jungle remembers in its own way. The bones still surface occasionally. The rust on equipment is still visible if you know where to look. The stories are still told by old soldiers who were there or who knew men who were there. Memory preserved. Not in official histories, but in the oral tradition of military units that passed lessons from generation to generation. The larger truth emerged slowly across decades. American military power was and remains formidable. Industrial capacity, technological superiority, organizational capability, resources that dwarf most nations. This power wins conventional wars against conventional enemies. It projects force globally. It achieves strategic objectives through combinations of diplomatic, economic, and military pressure. But tactical excellence in specific environments sometimes requires a different methodology. The Australians proved in New Guinea that small numbers of soldiers who adapted completely to hostile environments could achieve tactical results that conventional forces with superior resources could not. The lesson was not that American methodology was wrong. The lesson was that alternatives existed, that different environments rewarded different approaches, that flexibility and adaptation were themselves forms of superiority. The philosophical divide between American and Australian approaches never fully resolved. American military culture values standardization, doctrine, combined arms coordination. These values produce the most powerful military in history. They work in conventional warfare against conventional enemies. They achieve strategic objectives through operational excellence and resource superiority. Australian military culture values adaptation, flexibility, and individual initiative. These values produce small numbers of exceptional soldiers who achieve disproportionate results in specific environments. Neither approach is universally superior. Each fits different contexts and missions. A tension between them is healthy. It prevents either approach from becoming dogma. It forces both militaries to examine assumptions and consider alternatives. Captain James Holbrook stood in mud, watching 12 men walk toward an impossible mission in March 1943. He was witnessing something his training had not prepared him to understand. Not superhuman courage, though courage was required. Not superior technology, because the Australians carried older weapons with less support. Not better doctrine, because they operated outside conventional doctrine entirely. He was witnessing the result of complete adaptation to environment and mission. Soldiers who had learned lessons in combat that could not be taught in training, who had become something other than conventional forces through necessity and survival, who proved that warfare contains infinite variations and that success requires matching methodology to environment rather than forcing environment to match. Methodology. The Thompson fired its last rounds in Australian service decades ago. The soldiers who carried it in New Guinea are mostly dead. The jungle has reclaimed the battlefields. But the lesson remains, carved into military history and institutional memory, that sometimes the quietest professionals achieve what the most powerful forces cannot. That adaptation is a force multiplier that matches or exceeds technology and resources. That courage takes many forms, including the patience to wait days for the perfect moment to strike. That the jungle and by extension, any hostile environment will teach you or kill you, and those who survive the teaching become something extraordinary, not through supernatural ability, not through superior genetics or national character, through the simple willingness to learn what the environment teaches and adapt completely to its demands. The Australians learned. They adapted. They achieved the impossible. And they did it while carrying a heavy, outdated American submachine gun that became the symbol not of technological superiority, but of perfect harmony between weapon, methodology, environment, and the warriors who understood that sometimes the old ways, properly applied, outperform modern alternatives. The sound of the Thompson hammering through the jungle was the sound of that understanding made manifest. The sound of adaptation. The sound of warriors who belonged in places others merely visited. The sound that announced to the enemy and to allies alike, you don't belong here. This is our jungle, and we will prove it one impossible mission at a time.